Hey everyone, welcome to session 178 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. And in this episode, we're going to hop in a time machine and take a trip back to April 2021, almost a year ago. Yes, that's correct. This episode of the Behavioral Observations podcast comes from a recorded panel discussion at last year's Verbal Behavior Conference. The panel consisted of Drs. Pat McGreevy, April Kisamore, Nicole Rodriguez, Alice Shillingsburg, Hank Schlinger, and Vince Carbone. And longtime listeners will recall that I interviewed many of these speakers in the lead up to that event. One of the reasons I held back on publishing this panel discussion until now is that the 2022 Verbal Behavior Conference is coming up right around the corner. And I thought this would be a great way to get folks psyched up for it. The 2022 event will be taking place both in person and virtually over April 7th and 8th. If you can't make it to Austin, Texas, then head on over to behaviorlive.com/VBC for more info on how to tune in from afar. One of the unique things about the 2022 event is that Dr. Hank Schlinger will be teaching a 4-part verbal behavior masterclass to get you prepared for the conference. These are outside of the conference dates. These will occur in 4 2-hour sessions that will take place on February 16th and 23rd and March 2nd and 9th. The conference itself will feature Vince Carbone, Francesca Dell'Espinosa, Tamara Casper, Pat McGreevy, Sarah Lashago, Kevin Luzinski, Kelly Rich, David Roth, Mark Sundberg, and Hank Schlinger. I will be there too to host the 2022 panel discussion. So again, if you're interested in learning more about this event, head on over to behaviorlive.com/VBC to learn how to register. I hope to see everyone there. And this episode is brought to you by Tate Behavioral, a progressive ABA provider located in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts. If you're a BCBA looking to work for a supportive and innovative team and live in the heart of charming New England, visit tatebehavioral.com. And we're also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. If you're a new BCBA, or a BCBA of any experience level for that matter, and you need an independent person to advise you on today's job market, go to hricolorado.com to schedule a confidential appointment with Barb Voss right away. That's hricolorado.com. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this panel discussion from the 2021 Verbal Behavior Conference.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Okay, we are apparently live here at the Verbal Behavior Conference 2021 panel discussion. My name is Matt Sikoria with the Behavioral Observations Podcast. I am pleased to be joined by Drs. Vince Carbone, April Kisamore, Hank Schlinger, Alice Shillingsburg, Nicole Rodriguez, and last and certainly not least, Dr. Pat McGreevy. Pat, we just followed I think the word that I came up with it was like, I felt like I was in church. It was like a high mass or a homily of all things goodness as it relates to supporting individuals with exceptional needs. And as before we went live here, a couple of friends of mine have been texting me saying, how on earth is the panel going to follow that? And so all of that to say, that was just a tour de force. So if people are listening to this and and missed it and can get that on playback, I highly recommend doing so. So anywho, this is primarily a Q&A just for the audience. So I would love to see a lot of people just, fire your questions right into the chat here. We want to make sure this serves you primarily. I've got a couple of questions on my mind that I think can maybe get the wheels turning while people are, maybe thinking of questions on their own. McGreevy always takes us to church. Preach, Pat, preach. That's from Danielle. Let's see how much we can embarrass Pat through this process. I think that should be a worthy goal of this panel. What do you say, folks?
Okay. All right. Ready? Go.
All right. He's putting the hat on backwards. Yeah. Very good. Very good. All right. there's so many great presentations today in addition to yours, Pat. And so one of the things I was just thinking about is, what are some, I suppose one area I'd like to start is, Alice, I noticed with your presentation, there was lots and lots of questions. When you started talking about eliciting those attention responses at the table without prompting and things like that, that generated a ton of questions. So what I'd like to do is maybe just to get everyone's thoughts about using prompts. And Pat, you talked about that as well. Has your attitude regarding prompts changed recently, or maybe even not recently? Or is there something about common practice that you see out there today? And again, I know, Pat, you talked about this, but I would love to get everyone's perspective that you'd like to see behavior analysts do differently. I know there's like a lot of behavioral folklore out there of just kind of practices that we just kind of do that kind of hang around, and they might not necessarily be useful. So if we can maybe just go around the Brady Bunch squares here and get people's thoughts on that, that might be a good thing to kick this off. And while you guys are answering that, I would love, again, for the audience at home to start firing your questions there into the chat, and we can maybe pick some other topics that would be fun for everyone to get share their perspective on. So, Alice, do you want to take that away, since it was your talk that spurned all this?
Yeah, sure. Was it just to make sure I understand, just the use of physical prompts, or? Well,
I guess more generally, there was a lot of nuance of I think, and that, which I really enjoyed, of deciding when and when not to use physical guidance. And I really loved how the rapport building process really reduced the need to do that. Yeah. So, if you want to expand on, take a minute or two to expand on that. And again, I would like to get other people's thoughts on that as well.
I mean, I could say, also just briefly, like, I appreciated Pat's description of sort of like, how if you're training a big group of people and you put in these sort of arbitrary sort of prompt hierarchies, that can go awry quickly. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so when I talk about the work that we've done in this project, I specifically talk about kind of guidelines, but you got to still use your clinical skill and judgment. And one of the most important things, I think, that help guide us as to when to use physical guidance and when not is to be responsive to the person that I'm working with. There's nobody more important in the room than the person who's on the receiving end of my intervention. And they need to receive that intervention positively, and so I think it's really important to teach clinicians, RBTs, whatever, whoever you're working with, to make that judgment and to be responsive. And, just like, was described in our last presentation, what's the worst that can happen? You remove a prompt, there's an error, you go right back in. And having that sort of responsive back and forth, I think, is such an incredibly important thing to teach, as opposed to just sort of, we use this prompt hierarchy, or we use 3-step guided compliance. That's risky, especially if it's not well received by the student or the child that you're working with.
All right. I'd be interested in other thoughts on prompting, whether if anyone else wants to jump in, please have at it.
I think Pat's notion of prompting out the latency is a good one. You'll frequently hear people talk about, and others who take a more cognitive approach, that the long latencies that you see in many children are the result of processing sort of problems, and that you shouldn't prompt out those because you have to give the child the time to process the information and come up with a response. Well, probably those latencies are related to some neurobiological process that's going on, but that doesn't mean that can't be taken care of. And if you didn't think teaching children with autism to overcome a neurobiological disorder would work, then why would you be doing it? So prompting is one of our procedures. So I frequently talk about the fact that we can prompt that out, basically shorten the latency. And once you shorten the latency, there's no reason to talk about what's going on inside the brain and some processing problem. You can really talk about procedures that get rid of it. And if you want to think about it, we cure processing problems through prompting out the latency. If you want to talk that way, but it's not of very much use. Look at the behavior and look at the change that comes from prompting. So I think that's an important discussion to have with people who sometimes like to invent explanations for behavior, and prompting can help to get them to better understand what's going on.
Got it. Anyone else want to jump in on the issue of prompting?
Yeah, Ogden Blinsley, who was my professor, used to use this little story about prompting, and he'd say, prompting is like being a good thief. You sneak in the back door, get what you came for, and leave before anybody realizes you were there. And he said, but the most important thing is sometimes people fade before they got what they came for. They fade a little too early, you know. There was a lot in that expression, you know. Yeah, get out as fast as you can.
I think it also comes down to the idea of behavioral artistry. You know, a lot of clinical practice these days doesn't necessarily involve teaching people how to rely on and develop real clinical skills. You know, just kind of knowing when it is that you should start getting rid of that prompt or what type of prompts you should be using as a practitioner. And so I think this is something we need to move toward as a field, is how is it that we can do a better job of training during clinical practice or practicum opportunities such that people really are learning more about this artistry aspect of being a behavior analyst. We do have some research going on in one of my labs right now where we're looking at teaching BCBAs in training how to learn and hear no, whether it's a vocal no or any other type of response that a learner might make that is indicating that they don't appreciate that prompt that you're using at that moment. And there's some other way that maybe you could present a reinforcer that doesn't involve touch, for instance. And so that's something that we're working on now, is trying to figure out how to best teach people to recognize and then ultimately be responsive to those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Karen asks, and Karen, thanks for jumping in right away. What are your feelings on PODD or partner facilitated communication systems? Do you consider those as independent bands? I'm asking on behalf of a few special education teachers who are now utilizing the VB map and EFL as assessment tools.
Well, it depends on the specific forms of those. Some of those, yeah, they'd be okay, but some really don't lend themselves. They're a lot like facilitated communication, and they're a lot like the care provider does it without much movement on the part of the learner, and so therefore, when the helper goes away, so does the response. I think it has to be looked at individual form, one after the other, and see.
Let's see, Carissa, one challenge I've seen over the years is that the high burnout at the RBT level makes it hard to get the therapist to a competence level that they can move in and out of those prompt levels fluidly. What, I suppose, the question there is more of a statement, I suppose, but I think there's perhaps an implied question of what do you do about that? You know, so what have you folks seen out and about in your work and your research, et cetera, that could help with these types of scenarios that are, I guess, pretty common?
I mean, I think that you're touching on a really real issue. And it's kind of this balance of, we know certain things work, and maybe prompting procedures, having some general guidelines, some general procedures by which you go about doing things, like 3-step could be kind of like your baseline procedure, but what are the conditions under which you should deviate from that? I think also just, it is a training issue. And I think that, I think when you can, again, I don't know how other people feel about this, but I think at the very least, there's a nice baseline to have if you can't get to that artistry piece. But if you can start to teach about how to deviate from those and the conditions under which you should deviate from those, then you should. Can you get everyone to that point? that's another issue. And I think, as kind of April pointed out, is, how do we get people to that point? And also, how do we, what's the target? Because if there's this artistry piece to it, how do you characterize what's controlling my behavior as a behavior analyst that I'm responding to, that's leading to the artistry? And so I think there's multiple parts to it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is one, what are those skills that we should be focusing on? And I'm not exactly sure that we have that nailed down. And two, yes, how do we get people there? And then I do think that, there is some value to have some to baseline, okay, maybe we're not getting to the artistry level, but we know this works.
Hey everybody, I want to take a quick break here and let you know that this part of the podcast is brought to you by Tate Behavioral. Do you want to work for a progressive ABA agency with highly competitive benefits and a strong emphasis on professional development and growth? Do you want to work in a setting where you can be trained to implement peak, ACT, practical functional assessment, and skills-based treatment while collaborating with speech-language pathologists and other practitioners working on staff? Well, Tate Behavioral is located in the beautiful Pioneer Valley, and it's a growing behavioral and speech-language firm looking for 2 mid-career BCBAs who are interested in stepping up their careers. Tate is nestled within a region of strong communities, good school systems, and an area with loads of New England charm year-round. Tate works across all settings, including home, community, and school consultation, and they have a newly opened day school for special education students in Longmeadow, Mass. Tate Behavioral has also established a new clinical resident position for graduate students looking to learn and grow, all in a collaborative setting. So if this sounds interesting to you, and you want to learn more about their BCBA positions, take a look at their website, tatebehavioral.com, and connect with the senior leadership team. All right, let's get back to the panel discussion.
One thought I have about that is first of all, lack of supervision. Many of our programs, unfortunately, don't provide a level of supervision where you can sufficiently train someone. But, Greer's notion, and I've tried to adopt this, Doug Greer's notion of the teacher as a strategic scientist, and basically look at the behavior of the child you're working with and come under the control of that behavior. I think that's what Nicole was kind of getting at there, that the behavior of the child is an independent variable that controls your behavior. And I think when somebody's really good and sensitive to the behavior of the individual in terms of how they're progressing, what they're doing, what they're saying, then it starts to look like artistry as opposed to science. And I think it's a matter of bringing somebody under the control of this independent variable called the child's behavior. Skinner often talked about that. Why did he design an operant chamber to look like it did and have a lever versus a key to peck? Well, the behavior characteristics of the organism was the independent variable that controlled his behavior. And I think that I try to do that, but I'm usually working with BCBAs who are the teachers as opposed to RBT. But currently, the current insurance model kind of forces the issue, and it makes it sometimes more difficult to do. That was kind of some of my thoughts on that.
I think it also comes down to the contingencies of reinforcement that we have in place for our employees too. We expect very specific things oftentimes from our RBTs, and there's not a lot of opportunity for them to practice those behavioral artistry skills or even start developing them, because we have a very distinct list of tasks that they must hit during the day or programs that must be ran in a particular way. And this comes back to what Pat was saying earlier, that we need to be a little bit more fluid in general, perhaps, when we're designing the programs for our learners, just such that our RBTs are learning this skill set from the onset of their experience. And I think we also need to be more mindful about how it is that we're training our RBTs. There need to be ongoing opportunities for this type of training. One of the things that we struggle with the most at my private practice is teaching our staff how to provide more naturalistic learning opportunities, because that's hard. You really have to think about how to contrive the environment to evoke mands and tacts and interverbals in a way that you're not sitting knee to knee at a table necessarily, that you're programming for generalization from the outset. But we tend to focus so much, I think, coming back to that notion of here's the way we're training you. Here's the protocol we need to get through. Here's our checklist we're going to check off, make sure that you've mastered all of these competencies, and then now you're allowed to go work with the learner. Good luck. We'll see you later for your annual evaluation.
One of the most effective things that I found over the years is if you just take a simple camcorder, put it on a tripod, and put it over a person's shoulder so they can see the learner, and then just force it into 3 or 4 minutes. Something that's not going to take forever to monitor. It's just, you're just looking at a little tiny bit of their teaching, prompting, assessment behavior, whatever it is. And then just describe, okay, here's what I would have done. When you did this, I did this. Or I might suggest this when you did this, or see, that's the way to do that. You got in there and prompted that. Look how you did that. I don't know, something of that nature. That's what we've used over the years, but not systematically enough.
Very good. I want to shift gears here. I actually want to make a brief housekeeping note as well. I use the word chat, and I guess I inadvertently used it interchangeably with the questions tab, I suppose. So we've got questions both in the chat and in the actual proper place where they're supposed to go. So I apologize for the error. There is one question in the questions, tab. For Hank, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. Dr. Schlinger, what do you think about refining the distinctions of listening versus listener behavior as a difference in mediating responses or covert behavior, a part of listening behavior? Could the definitions be refined in a similar method of preciseness as Palmer defined intraverbal versus intraverbal control? Or does bidirectional naming and joint control satisfy these variables when the distinction is made with mediated and unmediated responding? That's from Lori. Lori gets points for a very nuanced and sophisticated question. I had to read quite slowly, so I didn't mess it up.
She does. So, well, I've already assigned her some bonus points for that question. So.
Oh, yeah, unquestionably, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because the way that I approached that in my talk today and will continue tomorrow is, as I said, following from Skinner's 1945 paper, rather than asking what things are, which many behavior analysts still fall into the trap of. We ask, well, what is a reinforcement? Or what is, stimulus control? Or what is listening? The approach that Skinner suggested way back then was look at the variables that evoke those responses as verbal responses in individuals, and that will tell you what they are. There is no essential definition of anything. If you want to know what someone means by reinforcement, look at the variables in the setting that cause them to say reinforcement. Unfortunately, you might be disappointed because what you'll find is that many behavior analysts, the variables are not always the same. But for listening, all I was trying to do was just to say, when we say that we're listening, try to identify the behaviors that are occurring. And it seems to me that the behaviors that are occurring when we say we're listening are that we're talking to ourselves about what the speaker is talking about. And so I tried to identify, what I thought were the primary response forms or, functional response classes, and they seem to be echoic and intraverbal behavior. The question, the question keeps moving because let me see, where is that question again? Now I can't find it anymore. Okay. What I'm going to talk about tomorrow is I'm going to talk about how echoic and intraverbal behavior on the part of the listener, that is what I'm calling listening, is involved at a basic level in joint control, as was already discussed today by Vince, I think. Because after all, in joint control, what are you doing? You're engaging in echoic, self-echoic behavior, and then tacting or textual response. And also remembering and understanding, and in what people are referring to as derived relational responding. And I'll just give you a teaser. I'm going to make the case tomorrow that there is no such thing as derived responding at all, that it's all directly taught. But I'm not going to give you any more than that because it will give away my talk tomorrow. So, but I think that's a good question. I'd be happy to entertain a follow-up if she's not persuaded.
Okay. Well, while Lori might be give Lori a little bit of time maybe to put a follow-up in there. In the meantime, one of the neat things about this question function, people can upvote questions to kind of bump them up to the top of the list. And so that makes it convenient for me. So here's the most upvoted question right now. In terms of improving an individual's intraverbal repertoire beyond simple intraverbals or rote responses, can you point us in the direction of good resources for determining a logical general sequence that might provide a sort of hierarchy in terms of complexity of intraverbal responses other than the BB map? And that's from Sarah. And that's up for grabs. So whoever wants.
That's a great question, Sarah. I didn't say this today because I often keep this to myself. Well, my students know in my verbal behavior class, but the intraverbal was my favorite verbal operant. I really do embrace it and I love it. I love everything about it. I love the simple intraverbal. I love the complex intraverbal. They're all just so fun. So when I'm thinking about teaching intraverbal, going from more simple to more complex, there is this great intraverbal subtest in Sundberg 2011, where they started with very simple groups, where I think it starts with like fill-ins, and then it goes up to questions where there's more multiple control involved in the responses. So you might have a fill-in peanut butter and jelly, and you get up to group like 8, where you're answering questions like, what's a fruit that's green? What's an animal with stripes? So that's one really good resource for looking at sequencing of intraverbals. And then Andresa de Souza and Wayne Fisher have a paper. What, Nicole, were you on that one? You were, right? You were involved with that one, yeah. That was published last year, Nicole, the year before? Somewhere in that time frame.
I'm actually talking about it tomorrow, too.
Perfect. So Nicole's going to tell you all about it tomorrow. They do talk in that study also about a progression for teaching intraverbals as well.
And actually, a lot of what I'll be talking about tomorrow is related to basically this idea of carrying targets through in teaching from like a curriculum sequence, so to speak, looking at some of the commonalities between D'Souza and some of the other stuff that I talked about today.
Yeah, I had the good fortune to speak to 200 speech language pathologists on Monday virtually, and the question that they asked me to speak about was answering WH questions. I tried to dissuade them and tell them that I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, but they were resistant. They wanted to hear about the intraverbal, not knowing that they were asking for the intraverbal. So I spoke for a whole day. Nicole's research, April's research, and others were a mainstay. What I tried to do is just walk them through the difference between simple and more complex verbal conditional discriminations, all the procedures that you can use to overcome them. There's a large number of them. And then, of course, ended with problem solving as probably one of the most important aspects of that. I was surprised by the fact that they kind of got it, because their notion is it's a matter of the maturing of the cognitive processes, and that explains where the intraverbal comes as compared to just attack. But they kind of got it. And the research by Nicole and D'Souza, Fisher, and of course, April and Rachel Sauter's work was a big part of what I described. And it seems to play pretty well, even with speech to language pathologists, if you can translate a little bit. So that was good news.
The WH questions is rotating across the WH questions. Is that what we're talking about? So this is like multiple control that you have to listen to the who, what, when, where, and then the other part of the question. Is that what they were talking about, Dr. Carbone?
Yeah, that was part of it. And they start with the notion that there's 2 parts to the intraverbal. There's first the comprehension part, and then you have to, based upon your comprehension, you respond. Not breaking it into 2 separate parts, like you're saying. You have to first comprehend that that's a where question, and then you can talk about location. It's an odd way for us of thinking about it, but yes, that was part of the issue.
Yeah, and I'm just going to speak off the cuff here, but I think a couple of things come to mind. Is one, I wonder, before you get to rotating WH questions, like, should we just be targeting, again, just kind of zooming out and not thinking about necessarily this, we're targeting this question, but teaching kiddos to attend to multiple parts of the question. And so there might be simpler ways to do that before we get to the rotating WH question. And then this whole idea about comprehension, I think there's something to that in kind of talking about some of Schlinger stuff and, what are the conditions under which we use that term. But I think when it comes to interverbals, and I'm really convinced of this in our own clinical practice, is like visuals and pictures give interverbals meaning, right? And so how we sort of embed that within our interverbal training, either as picture prompts or things like that, or the scenic prompts, the visual imagining, things like that April was talking about. But, when we're teaching interverbals, if there's, I guess the comprehension piece is like, what does where mean? How do we teach what where means? How do you go about that? What does who mean? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with probably some multiple exemplar instruction, but also just bringing it to life with pictures. I don't know, maybe sorting who's and where's and things like that.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed.
All right, so another topic here that has been upvoted. How do you get families on board with a functional skill approach for a more impaired learner when families would rather see them meet academic milestones? And, there was a number of similar questions I've seen in both in the chat and elsewhere. This is certainly something I've seen just in, kind of my day job. And so, Pat, I know just based on your earlier talk, this is something you're clearly passionate about. Imagine you've probably had some fireside chats with folks about this. Maybe you want to start off here. If you're a clinician, you're in that position, how would you advise them to relate to that family and try to persuade them of what they would see the proper direction of treatment to be?
Well, my son Hunter is involved with his business partner are opening a new clinic in Orlando, and one of the things that's going to be a regular part of their initial intake is that you're going to have that conversation when the parents walk in the door. Intervention could lead several different ways, and we don't know now where it could go. And we'll talk often, and I'll keep you up to date, but it could go several different ways, and we don't know yet where it's going. When that's already happened, I think when I don't have any great specific ways to do this. I jump in with, you guys jump in, you probably are better at this than me, but it's really tough because you have to get them to set their expectations aside and look right at their child and just say, you really think this boy going to college, and life's not over. Life isn't over. This is not the end of things. This is just a different, what grandparent doesn't buy their little tiny one, a Hobbit sweatshirt? Come on. How many people buy their little grandsons a Hobbit sweatshirt? It's very common, and, or something like that, And they have those great expectations, but okay, that's fine to start that way. But then it's just a simple matter of looking at, here's what he has to have. If you exchange pictures in any format, how does that go to academic skills? It doesn't. It doesn't. There's no way it gets there. It doesn't. And I always prepare to have these conversations 4, 5, 6 times. It's not going to happen in 1 or 2 conversations. It's just not.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I want to know the answer to that question because I think it's a really tough conversation to have. And I really like what Pat said because I like the idea of sort of giving people kind of like planting the seed. We're going to see how this progresses from the get-go. And then we're going to have these conversations often. But yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question, but it's a really important question. And I think what I, and this kind of goes back to some of the stuff that Pat was talking to, is what I don't like to see is where people just keep on plowing through these skills that just they're not relevant for that kid in the big picture. And I think we always need to be going back to the big picture. Like what are we working on here? How is this helpful? And sometimes we do have to switch to those functional living skills. But yeah, so that's one of the things I really liked about what Pat said too.
It used to hit me really hard with the RFFC, TFFC things, like tell me something you wear, name something that's round and bounces, name some colors, all that kind of stuff, as I said earlier today. Even if you got answers to that, who would ever ask you that? It's like you're teaching a kid to answer a question they'd never hear again and hope they would use that answer with some other question. You know what I mean? In a sense. And it's like, and if they're 4 or 5, it's okay. You got time to work through that. They're 8 or 9. It's time to end that, I think, for most kids.
Yeah. I would just add a caveat that I think sometimes, the goal is not necessarily that question, but, bringing their behavior under multiple antecedent control or some other like emergent responding or some other thing that it's leading to. But that goes back to the point of you need to be looking at the bigger picture. Like,
yes.
Why are we teaching this skill? Is it because this skill specifically is important, or does it fit in some big picture, some grand scheme where it can lead to other skills, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the cool things about this conference is that not only do we have, really thoughtful presenters, but we happen to have a lot of excellent clinicians and thoughtful people in the audience too, and so there's a lot. I don't know if you guys are looking at the chat. I've been looking at the chat here and there, and there's a lot of great suggestions in there as well. One of them I think was Julie. I think it scrolled away, so I couldn't quote it directly, but said sometimes, it's just helpful to sit down with the parent and explain the prerequisites for some of these academic skills. And that could be one way to do that, certainly. Certainly there's no one way to do it, I suppose, to extend that. And as you said, Pat, it likely takes numerous conversations. So.
And I do think really quickly, I do think it also, there's not just what you say, but, and this is an obvious point perhaps, but it's how you say it, right? Like you got to remember that, these people may have different expectations for their child, and how do you approach that conversation in a compassionate way? So and maybe to be effective, you do need to have the conversation across multiple occasions so that you're not hitting them all at once with it. So I think just being thoughtful and practicing those soft skills too, that we as behavior analysts don't often talk about.
Definitely. Here's a question that is probably very difficult to answer, but as some of you folks are business owners, I'd like to hear your perspective on it, just maybe how you attack this issue. But question for the panelists. Can you give tips for getting clinic owners who may or may not be BCBAs on board with investing in staff training, curricula assessments, changes in day-to-day processes or schedules, et cetera, and support these sorts of teaching principles. I'm imagining that this may be the who may or may not. It's probably more of the may not be BCBAs, but you never know. But what would your thoughts be on that?
You every time you have turnover from your staff, because if you have BCBAs who are leaving or you have RBTs who are leaving, you have to put a lot of resources into finding and training new individuals. So if you can bring the hard line of the money to those people, that seems or tends to be a more convincing argument with regard to creating better systems for maintaining your current employees. I know, I own my business with 3 other BCBAs, but we still had to take the hard route to figure all of this out ourselves. And we actually hired some OBM folks to come in and give us consultation and assessment on our private practice. So maybe that's something else that you could consider, is having someone who's familiar with the field come in and help identify what the strengths and weaknesses are in your business. And maybe that will also be a more convincing argument to that person.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? What was it like hiring an OBM professional to come in and kind of essentially do behavior analysis in a clinic that does behavior analysis? I mean, when they made suggestions where we were like, oh, we should know this, or like, can you just kind of like share that experience? Because I'm just super curious about how that all went down.
I have to tell you, you have to walk into that situation reminding yourself that you don't know everything and that you're allowed to make mistakes because you're human and you're a business owner. And it's really humbling when you hear all of the mistakes that you're making as a behavior analyst when you're managing behavior of others, that you should have known about whenever you're doing it. But it's also just really great to think about how to apply the principles of behavior analysis that we're always using with our clients to our staff. It's the same stuff. It doesn't matter who it is that you're working with. It's just a different mindset. And so I think having that OBM person come in and talk to us, it's like, oh yeah, obviously we should have been thinking about that. But now we are, and we're working with exactly that oh geez moment. But like I said, we haven't had turnover for a while with our staff since we started introducing some of the suggestions from this OBM person. And we are definitely saving money on training people. I can tell you that, because we're doing ongoing training with our current staff rather than starting from scratch on a regular basis.
Well, good for you for investing in your business and especially in something that's certainly not billable, but certainly helpful in the long run. Vince, you were going to say something. I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, as a clinic owner for a number of years, I know exactly what people are talking about. The current way in which clinics run these days, maybe not all, but related to insurance reimbursement, you have to follow the money pretty much and the contingencies that come along with the economics of that. And a lot of times that doesn't get overridden by someone who is not committed to the field and they feel their job is to bring people along. So if you've got somebody that's driven by those sort of contingencies without some conflicting contingencies that might be there in a behavior analyst, you see decisions that are made. And unfortunately, the long-term effects of that, as April has pointed out in terms of turnover, don't easily control behavior unless they're pointed out and made explicit. So I think that's an issue. I don't know how to control those economic contingencies that manage that. I've tried to stay away from that by not taking insurance dollars. Is the way I've tried to avoid that, because I'm sure some of those contingencies, and especially if you have shareholders. You're answering to shareholders as much as you are anybody else when that occurs, or a board of some sort in a for-profit sort of agency. So it's a tough balance there. I don't know the solution to it other than rework the way in which we finance and provide financial support to clinic-based programs. The medical field has gone exactly the same sort of way, where physicians no longer work in private practice. They're part of a large group who pretty much manages everything, including the office staff. And all they do is show up for work each day on a shift. and you have the same sort of issues there with high turnover and problems. So I think that's the issue, and maybe there's some ways around it, but I've tried to avoid it. Is the only way I've been able to manage that sort of situation. Not a great answer, but that's kind of my analysis of it.
Okay. Here's a question that's been upvoted. More and more, I seem to come in contact with BCBAs who have only a superficial knowledge of verbal behavior. Since language and social skills are core deficits for ASD, shouldn't there be a greater emphasis on VB and training programs? What comments do you all have on the level of VB training provided to BCBAs? And that's from Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Well, if you look at the history of the task list, which informs the exam, verbal behavior hasn't even been on the task list all that long. I remember the fight to get it on, and I remember when Florida, and then it went national, and Jerry and all the people involved in that fight. Verbal, a lot of people think that verbal behavior is embraced by the vast majority of the behavior analytic community. I don't know, Vince and Hank, you guys probably know this better than me, but I don't get a sense it is. I think there's a whole lot of people in the behavioral community that wouldn't know a man from a door. I'm serious. They wouldn't.
Well, I've had some pretty strong opinions about training and behavior analysis, and about the role of the BCBA, or the BACB as it is. I think it's unfortunate that the BACB task list informs and strictly guides graduate programs in applied behavior analysis. I understand how that happened and why it happened.
Absolutely.
But I think, some of us over the years have seen our field move from a science-based field to a technology-based field. People who are trained as BCBAs. Now, the BCBA, in my view, the BACB has been good on, it's been a blessing and a curse. The blessing part is that we now have, all these people interested in our field. We also have, many graduate programs that have sprung up, as a result to meet the demand. But the curse, of course, is that they're teaching to the BACB, and they're not all those programs are training behavior analysts. They're training practitioners with a limited number of tools in the toolbox, as opposed to general problem solvers. And in the short term, that may not be too much of a problem. In the long term, I think it's going to be the death of the field, unfortunately. I hate to be cynical about that, but I didn't mean to be such a downer on that last comment.
Well, Hank, let me ask this follow-up question. Maybe you can lighten it up a little bit. Panelists, what are your opinions on contextual behavior science and acceptance and commitments therapy specifically? So I'm
going to mute myself.
Oh, I thought you'd have lots of things to say on it.
I do. I'm just going to say them with my mute.
I see.
Yeah. Well, can I mention a little bit about the sophistication of behavior analysts? I agree completely. That's a problem. What we've tried to do in our clinics is, first, number one, that in order to be an instructor, you must be a BCBA. That's because that's the basic minimum requirement. You have to be a BCBA, and then we consider the rest of it your residency. And that residency is basically 5 years of working as a therapist under good supervision with a radical behavioral approach to the problems, including Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior and understanding of radical behaviorism, being a strategic scientist. And 3 to 5 years, then you're ready to be a supervisor. Right now, the contingencies are that, in order to get funding, you have to have a BCBA supervising something. So why would you ever have them as an instructor? So you turn out people who have minimal skills, especially as it relates to analysis, and you throw them into supervisory roles because the funding mechanism dictates that. If you're not under those funding mechanisms, then your teachers are your BCBAs or working towards it, and they're going to be at least 3 to 5 years before they ever begin to supervise somebody because they've been through a radical behavioral sort of training program with lots of readings and lots of Skinner's analysis and lots of other sort of things, and then training to be a supervisor. So that's the way I've dealt with the issue of getting people who are not ready to do that to basically produce behavior analysts who are consistent with what we think is the appropriate level of skill. And if you don't take insurance money, you don't have that. You can do that. I think we've done it successfully in 2 clinics in the United States and now 2 overseas, and that's our model, and we'll kind of stick to it. But that's been my approach to that problem, and it's a real problem.
I agree, it's a real problem. Living in both worlds where I direct graduate programs in ABA and also run a clinic, I'm trying to balance out how to do both of these things. So for one, I have found as the director of these programs is that I kind of have to make up for what my students are not accessing in the field with regard to exactly what you just talked about, Vince. They're not really getting those opportunities to learn clinical decision-making skills or just problem solving in general with regard to practice. So I'm trying to create opportunities for them to learn and start practicing these skill sets within the classroom experience. But of course, now we have to worry about generalization, because we know generalization is not just a problem for kiddos with autism. Like, this is a problem for everybody. And so that's issue 1 that I haven't been able to tackle yet. But number 2 is I think we really need a solid curriculum for training BCBAs, what it is that people need to experience during their practicum or field experiences and learn to practice. I know there's a lot out there on how to set this up and how to run your meetings with people, but there's not anything yet that clearly defines how to teach your supervisees in the art of clinical decision making. And that's what we really kind of need as a field. The new book, Linda LeBlanc has a new book that came out not that long ago where they talk about each of these issues, but there's not a really good curriculum that goes along with it. And so this is something that we are also trying to work on at my private practice. We have currently a mentor system of levels for our BCBAs. So we do assessment when they come in as new BCBAs, and we figure out what level they might be responding to, and then we teach them on the skill sets that are in between. But it's not easy. And if you are an insurance-based company, I'm not quite sure how you could pull that off. And it's just like you're saying, I don't know how you can pull that off because the hours just don't exist to make that happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've developed a curriculum, just piecing it together as best I can, with lots of opportunities to test and evaluate and see where people are. But you're exactly right. The revenue stream is kind of part of the, at least certainly part of the problem, and I've tried to avoid it and think I have an obligation to do more than serve the children, which is of course our main focus, but it's to also serve the field in a better way and ensure that people come away after years of training to do that. But we also now have to compete, where BCBA instructor, where I can go and be a supervisor after I pass this test, and none of that is required. It's a big problem. It's all there. We all deal with it, and I figured you did as well, April, in the kind of position you are in as well.
I guess I could maybe chime in a little bit from the licensed psychologist side of things as well. I mean, I am wondering, will our field go in that direction? It's just an incremental process to sort of up the requirements more slowly. Going through a doctoral program in clinical child psychology, my practicum experiences were approved by the department. There was, they met the standard to say, this is good, versus sort of what's happening in our field, which is you can just have a job anywhere. And as long as there's a BCBA who works there, they can provide the supervision, which I would not be surprised that if that's going to over time change, just as it is the case in, the medical field and the psychology field. But it's just, not being able to do that kind of all at once. Similar to, I don't know exactly, but I think you can supervise with your BCBA immediately right now, but it's changing, I think, such that you have to be a year out or something like that, perhaps. You know what I mean? So I think it's the kind of thing that I hope there's not the death of the field coming, but instead that as the field grows, which is a blessing and a curse for sure, but as the field grows, that we can increase the requirements, put in some accreditations for practical experiences and things like that just aren't possible to do right now because we're so young. That would be the only thing that I hope.
That's a good answer. I need to clarify when I implied the death of the field, I didn't mean the field of applied behavior analysis or whatever today passes for applied behavior analysis. But from my perspective, there's very little analysis in applied behavior analysis. It's applied behavior something. The analysis is almost completely gone from the field. Whereas if you look in the early days, it's one of the 7 dimensions. And in the early days, and by early days, I mean late 60s, 70s, analysis was really a critical part of research in applied behavior analysis, and certainly in the experimental analysis of behavior. So I think that a number of circumstances have converged to push our field, and by our field I mean what it is today as really largely a practitioner-based field. In the early days, it was not a practitioner-based field. It was an experimental analytic field. And then once people who were the early EAB people, including, by the way, Jack, who was actually in a tribute I'm going to write about him in Analysis of Verbal Behavior, I'm going to argue that he could be considered the father of applied behavior analysis, because along with Ted Ione, they published the first real applied behavior analytic article. He was doing rehabilitation at University of Houston with Lee Meyerson, doing things long before anybody called it applied behavior analysis, taking the principles that they understood fully and thoroughly and applying them to the amelioration of any behavior problem that they encountered. They had a general set of problem-solving skills, understanding of the principles, and that's how they applied them. And you can see there was tons of research all through the 60s and early 70s on all kinds of unbelievable kinds of behaviors, conversion reactions, and schizophrenic and psychotic behavior, dementia, and just a whole range of things. And so when you throw autism and all the money that's available for autism treatment into the mix, you have what's happened to our field today. And it's it's great for families of kids with autism. It's great for the BACB and for people who want to go into the field. For the long-term health of what I consider the field of behavior analysis, I'm not so sure. I think we're just, as Vince mentioned, today's Earth Day. The problems of our planet are not problems of the planet. They're problems of human behavior. And I think we can all agree that we understand human behavior better than almost anybody, or at least as well as. But the way that our field is defined right now, I don't know how many of us are actually going to be able to go out and do that, apply the skills, the knowledge that we have to other problems that are facing us. So I just wanted to clarify. I don't mean the field as we now talk about it, because it seems to be pretty healthy, actually.
Thank you, Hank. In the last couple of minutes, I was actually going to ask if anyone had a good Jack Michael story. So I was pleased to hear that you brought him up unbeknownst to that. So if anyone wants, and I figured this would be kind of given some of the heavy stuff we've been talking about here in the last few minutes, if anyone has given that we're obviously paying homage to this great behavior analyst in person. If anyone wants to close with a quick Jack Michael story, this would be a good time to do it.
I have one. I have a brief one.
Sure.
I was fortunate enough. I never studied with Jack, but Jack agreed to kind of mentor me over an 8 or 10 year period later in my career, and I was grateful for every moment I hung out with him. And And I remember one time when we were in the process of writing Essential for Living, and he said, and I was struggling with, what do you call it when somebody looks at text and they respond according in an appropriate manner? An example being, you look at men on a restroom door and women, and maybe you can't read them, no, you can't say them, but through a process of teaching, you know which one to go in, you know the appropriate. And I said, what do you call that? So I said that to Jack. What do you call that? What do you think Jack said? Jack said, you know the answer to that. I said, no, what? I don't think I do. And then he followed it up and he said, what'd Skinner call it? And I didn't remember. And he said, Skinner called it responding to text as a listener. And that's, he used to do that with me all the time. And I just learned those little things. And I said, and Hank, when you were presenting this morning, I remembered that story. And you were talking about because you mentioned reading with a vocal direction, you added sort of as an anecdotal note, you stuck reading in there. You know, you can respond to text as a listener. Go ahead.
In a quote from Skinner, who included, reading. Yes.
All right, great. Well, Pat, thanks for sharing that, and it came right in on time too. So thanks for bringing us home. We are at just about at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So that's going to be a wrap for this panel. Thank you, folks, for sharing your thoughts, and thanks so much to the audience for writing in so many thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to them all, but I tried to read as many of them as I could. And thanks to Kelly and the rest of the folks at Central Texas Autism Center for inviting us all to do this. So long, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.